Hey guys, quick heads up before I start the video. The link down below takes you to my Patreon, where you can download the project files for this video. Also gain access to my premium tutorials and in-depth courses where we build games together from start to finish. Check out my Patreon below, gain direct access to years of experience so that you can start working on your dream game tomorrow. Hello everybody and welcome back to a new episode of my multiplayer Bean Battle Royale series. So in the last episode we set up this whole island here. So that's great. But if we take a look at a typical Battle Royale, then you would see water around the island. But most of the times, like in a game like PUBG, so PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, you would see a separate island, and that is basically where the players spawn on. Then on that island, you would basically have like a threshold. So you need to have like 100 out of 100 players. And when the 100 out of 100 players have connected to the session, then a countdown starts of like 60 seconds. Then players can run around on that little island, punch each other. And after the 60 seconds, the plane spawns in. Players will be in the plane, fly over the island and start to drop in. So that's what we're going to be working on in this video. Not on the actual plane and the players dropping in. But we're going to put some water around the island, get a little separate island, and we're going to get started on the match flow logic so that we actually have a count of how many players are in the session. Then when the minimum amount of required players are met, so in PUBG it's 100 out of 100, but here for testing purposes, since I can only test with like 2 windows, I'll say if two players are in the session, then we're basically going to start our 60 seconds countdown. I'll make it into 15-second countdown, and then basically we are ready to at that point start working on the events such as the plane actually coming in, spawning in, and things like that. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to click up here, and then we're going to click on shapes, plane, drag the plane over here. We're going to then set the scale to the plane to a very large number. So let's do something like 4,000. Like 4,000, and then we are going to reset here. So we're going to reset the location so that it's in the middle. So this is basically if I were to make this water, then this is where all my water would be, the little white parts here. So yeah, now that we got the plane in here, then I'm going to introduce you guys to my new water material. So if we go over here to assets, then we can click on materials and then water. So this is the new water material that I have set up for you guys. So if you're interested in checking this out, then download the project on Patreon where you can get access to it. So we're going to drag the water on the plane, and that will give us some actual ocean over here. So as we see, we now have an ocean. And then if we take a look in the landscape, since some parts of the landscape are a little bit lower than others, we also have some water entering into the landscape right now. So over here we see some glitches appearing since the mesh is at location 0. So what we're gonna do is, we're gonna change the mesh to be a little bit lower. Here we go, set it to like -100. And that should fix these glitches. So now we do have some nice natural water here inside of the landscape automatically. And that's perfectly fine. So we're going to keep it like that. And then if we take a look over the edge, then we see that we got our ocean water here. But the landscape is not really touching with the ocean water. So we're going to quickly go ahead and fix that by just simply putting the landscape a little bit lower. But as we see, we kind of reached the edge of the landscape already. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to click here on the landscape tool. Go over to manage and then click on add. And then we're going to add some more border around our landscape here. So we're just going to drag out here. Now one strip over here. Put the camera speed higher and just go all the way around the island. So there we go. And then this one, we're going to remove it. So we're going to click delete on this one. And then, so this part here, we're basically going to drag this under the water and then we're going to smoothen it out so that we get kind of like a coast or like a beach so that this actually goes into the water like that. That will make sense in just a little bit. And then what we need is that little separate island where players will actually spawn in. So we're going to make that over here on the left. So to make that, we're going to need some landscape here to work with. So something like this looks fine to me. Let's put this like this. All right, then next up, we're going to go into the sculpting tool and we need to drag this underneath the water. So to do that, we're going to select the sculpt one. And then we're simply going to hold shift and click to make it go lower like this. And then once we are a little bit under the water, then we can say that we use one setting called flatten. to basically drag that lower level, so this lower level water, all the way flat, all the way over here. So now we can get this landscape underneath the water. And now let's just go ahead and make sure that everything that needs to be underwater is put underwater. Okay, so now that we put most of that underwater, we kind of get to see what the point here is. So we get our island back again and it starts to make sense. Then we got this extra piece of land that will be the starting island. So we're going to sculpt this now. So some shape like this would work for me. And then we're going to click on smooth and we're going to smoothen out these edges a little bit to give it somewhat of a nice slope into the water like that. And there we go. So that gives us the little starting island over here. And we're going to smoothen out the edges of the actual island all the way around. Alright, so that gives us our beautiful island. So this is going to be the actual Battle Royale island, and this is that little side island. So for the little side island, we're going to give it a bit of a more natural look as well quickly. And then we can continue from there. And then we want somewhat of a flat terrain over here for the beans to actually have some normal play area to spawn on. Then we're gonna quickly smoothen that out a little bit. There we go. Now the edges of this island, I want them to be painted with a little bit of a kind of sand material. I don't really have a sand material, so we're going to be using a little bit of dirt. So I'm going to be painting some dirt like this to kind of make a little beach area. Now we're just going to make some starting area here for the beans. There we go. Then now that we're finished painting it, we're gonna go over to the actual island here and paint some beaches here as well. So this little part, I think it would be funny if we kind of have a beach here on this corner. So we will leave this corner like that. Then we go back to this little island and give it some final trees and some rocks. And there we go. So now we got ourselves the little starting island and the mainland. So that's great. Now that we got that, we can close all of our folders. Let's hit save all. Now we're going to be removing our player spawns that we had over here. So we're going to select them all over here, remove them. And then we're going to head over to our starting island here. And this is from now on where we will be using the player spawns. So we're going to put our camera speed back to 4. Click here and then click on basic, and then over here we're going to drag in some player starts. So we're just going to be putting some random player spawns all across here. So since it is a Battle Royale, we want plenty of them. So here we go. If we hit play, we spawn at a random player spawn, and that's it. So now we're here at this little island. So now that we got our spawning island, we're going to be working on some logic that we can actually get the game state to keep track of how many players are in the session. Then when that minimum amount of required players are met, we then want to start a counter, and the counter is then going to be ready for us to install the event to spawn the airplane, get all these players from that island into the airplane, and then give them the ability to drop out over the island. So let's go ahead and set that up. So for that, we're going to click here on blueprints. Then we're going to go over to game modes, and then we see our core game mode. So this is the game mode that we will be using for the gameplay. And then since we also want to be able to test our game easily in the near future, then we do not want our game mode to automatically keep checking all the time if we are actually at the minimum amount of players, and from there on basically start the countdown and spawn us in an airplane. So we also need a game mode to actually keep testing. So what we're going to do is that we're going to make another game mode class, and then we're going to make a specific folder in which we code the classes for our gameplay. gameplay. And in that gameplay class, we are actually going to be setting up this logic. So to do that, we're now going to be starting to creating some children off of these core classes here. So we need another class right now, which is called the game state class. Now the game state is responsible for keeping track of the state of the game. It is a replicated class that lives both on the server and on all clients. So if we have replicated variables there, then they can easily be read by all clients. So variables such as score, or if we run a replicate events down to all of the clients, we can also easily do those types of things with the game state class. So for example, if somebody dies and we want to have a kill feed that says another player died, and then the total amount of players that are still alive and left, then those types of events can easily be handled by the game state, since it can replicate down to all the individual clients. So right here, we're going to do right click, and then we're going to go to all classes and type in game state. And then we don't want the game state base, but we want the actual game state class. The game state base is intended better for single player, and the game state class, as it says over here, behaves like a multiplayer match-based game. So this game state here is better suited for multiplayer. So we go ahead and click select and call this BP GS, which stands for game state underscore core. Hit save all, and there we go. So now that we got that, we're going to make that subfolder that we're going to call gameplay. So now we're going to be making child classes out of all of these core classes to be for our gameplay folder. So we're going to right click and click on create child blueprint. And then this character, we're going to call it gameplay underscore character. And then the core game mode, we're going to call it gameplay underscore GM for game mode. The game state, we're going to call it BP game state BP. We're going to call it BP gameplay GS for game state, and then the player controller BP gameplay player controller PC. So these ones, we're going to drag them into the gameplay folder, and there we go. So why do we not want to code the functionality in here? Well, like I explained, then we would have that logic that would automatically start checking things, counting down, start executing events. And we don't want that because we do want to have some type of a testing mode as well. So when we're going to be working on the guns later, we don't want to test that type of stuff here inside the Battle Royale level, or looting and loot crates and such. So we do want to keep our separate testing level here, where we will simply be using the core classes, or perhaps we will start to make another folder called testing, which we will then make new child classes again specifically for testing, in which we will not have these gameplay events installed. So for now, we're going to go back to the Battle Royale level and start coding our gameplay class here. So we're going to go and open up the gameplay game state. We're going to make it bigger. And then next to the gameplay game state, we're also going to open up the gameplay game mode. So for those of you who don't know what a game mode is, well, a game mode is basically a class that exists on the server only. It is a class which defines your game mode, so it contains all of the other classes here. So that's why it's also separated from the other core classes. So we got a game mode, and the game mode determines the default pawn, determines the HUD class used, but determines the player controller used, the game state, and the player state. Now do keep in mind, the game mode only exists on the server, so replication from the game mode down to the clients is not possible. So you can only use server-side logic here, but the game state does exist on the server and on all of the clients, so this one can be used to code replicated logic. So why are we going to use the game mode right now? Well, basically, if we take a look over here under the functions and then click on override, then we see some very useful functions that the game mode offers by default. So for example, we see this function called OnPostLogin, and we see a function called OnPostLogout. And if we hover over it, it says notification that a player has successfully logged in and has been given a player controller. So this event basically notifies that we get a new connection into our session. And then the onLogout event notifies us that a player is disconnecting. Besides that, we got a couple of other handy events, so we can use the game mode to also start a match and to end matches. But for that, we're going to be using custom logic. Now, the game mode is also responsible for handling the starting of players and spawning players. So the reason why you spawn automatically when you assign a character here and hit play is because that is by default installed inside of the game mode, and it is handled by these types of functions such as find player start, choose player start, and spawn default pawn 4. So these types of functions, you can override them to basically code your own custom logic in here or to use these by default, but we're going to be using our own custom logic. And when it comes to the spawning here, then the default class here that spawns on the island is perfectly fine for us. So we're not going to need to adjust these functions over here. So be sure that if you click these functions and you're not going to use them, then click them and remove them, because otherwise you're going to be overwriting them. So what we need is when a player connects to our session, this is fine that the player spawns on this island like that, and then getting the player into the airplane, we cannot easily set that up using functions such as these ones, so we're going to have to code that all ourselves. But what we are going to use is that event OnPostLogin. So we're going to type in OnPostLogin, and we're also just going to quickly type in OnLogout to get the connection and disconnection. So I'm going to right click it, and this we call it connecting player, and this we call it disconnecting player. So each time that a player is going to be connecting, we basically want to send a little notification to our game state, in which we're going to be checking how many players there are and if that amount is equal to the minimum acquired amount to start a match. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable inside of our game state here, and we're going to call it minimum required players. And then we're going to set that to be an integer. Hit compile and save, and we're going to set it to, let's say, 2 players. Now next up, what we can do is, since we know that the game mode exists on the server only, we can easily basically cast to our game state to call events here. So let's say that we code an event here and we call it check if ready to start. So we could call this event here check if ready to start. Then from the game mode, what we can do is that we can either type in get game state, and then from the get game state, we could cast specifically to the cast to BP gameplay game state class. So we can specifically cast to this class, and then we can call the event that exists there. So now if we drag off of here, we can type in check if ready to start. So we could do it like this, or we could start using interfaces. And interfaces are a lot easier to use, a lot more friendly in my opinion, because it cleans up a lot of an unnecessary blueprint logic. And we don't have to start calling specific events here. So if we're going to be using interfaces, then we can more easily start to communicate. So I'll show you what I mean by that by creating one. So first of all, inside of the blueprints folder here, we're now going to be creating a new folder. We're going to call it interface, or let's call it actually interfaces. And then we're going to right click here, go to blueprint, and then here we see blueprint interface. So they can only be found here. They cannot be found if you type in here, interface. So here you cannot find them. So we're going to right click, go to blueprint, and then here click on blueprint interface. And we're going to call this BPI game state. So this is going to be our general game state interface. So if we open this up, then what does it give us? Well, on the right here, it gives us an overview of the functions that we're going to be coding in here. And then on the left here, we see a read-only graph. So interfaces are literally only intended to interface with other classes. So we can simply send messages and data across, or we can use it to retrieve data. So we can either input data to send it through from one class to another, or we can output data to retrieve data from one class to another. But we cannot actually code in these classes themselves. Interfaces are simply just a form of communication. So now that we made the interface, then we're going to be implementing it over here inside of the game state. So we're going to click here on the game state, remove this function, click on class settings. And then over here on the right, we see that we currently have no interfaces installed inside of our BP gameplay game state. So to change that now, we're going to click on add, and then we're going to type in the name of our interface called BPI game state. And then we see that it's added. We also see that the function appears here that exists inside of this interface. And then we're going to hit compile and save. So what type of function do we need here? Well, we want the gameplay game mode to basically communicate an event to our game state that we notify when players connect. And then when the game state gets these notifications, the game state can each time execute a check to see if the amount of players that are in the session are greater or equal than the minimum amount of players. If that check is indeed met, then we can start the countdown event, which would then later on in the next video hook into us actually being able to spawn inside of that airplane. Check out Cactus Center right now on Steam in Early Access. It's a very fun multiplayer video game, cheaper than the Starbucks coffee. So if you want to have a good time with your friends or strangers, click that link down below, and I appreciate every single one of you, and enjoy the rest of the video. Bye! So if we go back to our interface, then we're gonna rename this function to make it say notify player connection. So it's just going to be a notification that a new player has connected. So inside of the game state, we can now see that event over here. And we can actually also categorize the events to keep better track of it. So inside of the interface here, we can then basically go over here to category. And then we could call this something like match flow. So this is a function that we are going to use to basically control our match flow. So now we're going to hit compile and save, go back here again, and we will see that it is now properly inside of this category. Then over here, you can either right click and implement, or you can simply double click it to get the event into the graph. So how does this event then get called by our game mode? Well, for that to occur, we can simply go to our game mode, and then we can simply type in the name of the event or function. So notify player connection. So we're simply going to right click and type in notify player connection. And then we see that there's a type message. So that's what we need. So we're going to click this and then we get our interface here. And then what's the big difference between the casting and the interfaces? Well, if I was to have a custom event here and call it do something, and hit compile and save, then what we see is that with a cast, we basically need to get our object first. So the object that we want to cast and communicate to is the game state. So we're going to type in get game state. And then we need to be specific about the game state class that we actually want to communicate to. So for that, we type in cast to BP gameplay game state. Now this is a very specific one-to-one blueprint communication, and then we get this pin out of here containing all of the data, basically the reference of the gameplay game state. So out of here we can then type in do something. And then what makes a cast easy? Well, we can in this case simply double click and it takes us to that event. With interfaces, we cannot double click. So if we double click this, it will simply take us to the blueprint interface over here, but we cannot actually see what the endpoint is. So it will never take us to the actual location where we implemented it. And that is because interfaces are one-to-many communication. So whatever we plug in here as a target is what it's going to be communicating to. And then when in our level we have installed our gameplay game state, then when we call this function called getGameState, then it will automatically know that this is the game state that is active in the current level, as we have set it up over here under the game mode settings. And that is basically why it would then properly communicate. So we can literally just get this getGameState function and plug it into the target, and that's it. So every time that somebody's going to connect, we're going to basically get the game state and communicate the notify player connection event. So now we're going to hit compile and save, and then over here we can remove this one, and then we can run a little print string off of here that says hello, or let's make it say player connected. And there we go. Then we hit compile and save. Then if we go back here in the level, then we see that we still have the core game mode selected. So what we need now is the gameplay game mode. And then for the gameplay game mode, we're going to open it up and we're going to set it up to contain the correct classes. So we can either do that here inside of the gameplay game mode if we click on class defaults and set them up over here, or we can do it directly in the level here. So we basically want to swap out the core character with the gameplay character. Then we're going to have the gameplay game state as the game state class and our gameplay player controller as the controller class. We're then going to hit save. So let's go ahead and give that a test. So if we hit play, on the top left corner, we then see that little print string firing player connected. So then we're also going to quickly test it with 2 players as a listen server. And we will see player connected and player connected. So now we get 2 notifications that a player indeed has connected. So now with that setup, we can then start to code the rest of the functionality off of here inside of the gameplay game state. So we're going to drag in our minimum required players, and then we're also going to right click and we're going to be typing in num players. And then what this gives us is a default function with which we can basically see how many players are connected in the session. So if we are to do a print string and then make it say 15, then we're going to plug this in here to see if it works. So if I hit play with 2 players, it will say 1 and then it will say 2. So now that we got that, we can then basically just start to make our actual logic here. And what that is this greater or equal to the minimum amount of players? If true, we want to do something. And that something that we want to do is going to have to be communicated to the UI of all the players, where we will have to start a countdown. So now we need to go ahead and set up some UI. So we're going to close these classes and keep the game state open. So for that, we're going to go here to the widgets class, and then inside of the game widget, we're going to be creating a new widget, which we're going to call HUD. So we're going to call it WB, let's call it gameplay underscore HUD. So that's going to be our heads up display. And now we want to add this to the player screen as a full like canvas widget. So we're going to open up the panel, put the canvas in here. And then when looking at a battle royale, then we basically want a lot of unique elements inside of the UI here. So on the bottom right here, we would want something that shows us our current weapon and if we need to reload. In the top left, we might want to see our HP bar, or here in the bottom. And then for now, we want like a counter up here that shows us how many players are in the session. And then when the players are met, we then basically want to see the countdown starting. So for that, we're going to make a separate blueprint and we're going to call it WB underscore player count. And then we're going to make one more and we're going to call it WB underscore match start countdown. So first of all, we're going to be working on the player count here. So we're going to open it up. And it's simply going to be some text. So we're going to drag in some text. We're going to set this to be desired on screen so we can see the actual size of it. And then we're going to scale it a little bit because 24 is pretty big. So let's make it something like 18. And what we want this to say is something like 1 out of 2 players. Something like that would be fine. Then we're going to click on the text and give it a variable name. So we're going to call it player amount underscore text and set it to be a variable. Hit compile and save and go over to the graph. Okay, so now that this is all done, we basically need to set up the widget blueprint player count to actually update. So the default value here, I changed it to say dash slash and then the minimum amount of required players. So yeah, let's go ahead and set that up. So to set that up, we basically need to go back to our game state. And what we want to do here is that we want to set the number of player state to be a replicated variable so that the clients can read this value. So what we're going to do here is that we're going to drag off of here, click promote to variable, and we're going to call this current amount of players. Then we're going to hook it up over here and we're going to set it to be replicated. So then we hit compile and save, and there we go. So every time that we notify that we have another connection, we're going to be basically pulling the amount of player states and we're going to be updating this replicated variable over here. Now, of course, players can also disconnect. So when the players are on this island over here, they can basically be connecting, but also disconnecting. And we need to take that into account as well. So what we're going to have to do inside of the gameplay game mode is that not only the event OnPostLogin event connects to this one, but also the OnLogout. So instead of making it like that, we're just going to duplicate it over here. So when a player logs out, then we also want to send a notification, and then we want that notification to also basically update this variable over here. Now we're not going to touch this logic just yet. We're just going to make it so that the player count is now going to work. So with this replicated variable here, we can go over to the widget blueprint player count. We're going to go over to its graph, and then we can set up the logic over here. So we're going to type in event construct. And then off of event construct, we're going to type in get game state, and we're going to cast to our BP gameplay game state. And then we're going to have this widget save a reference to it. So as BP gameplay game state is fine, we're then going to hit compile and save. And then we're just going to set it up very easily here. So we're going to go over to the designer. We're going to select our text, and with the text selected, we can then go over here to the text category, and we can then see that there's an option to bind. And then off of bind, we see as blueprint game state, which is the reference that we just set up. And then out of here, we can get a couple of things. And one of those things is the current amount of players. So if we click over here, then we can basically bind this value to the current amount of players. So what would it do right now? Well, if we go ahead and hit play, then we see that it says 1 and it says 2. So both on the server and on the client, we now get that replicated variable. But we don't want it to just say 1 and 2. We wanted to say that extra text that we wanted it to display as well. So we're not going to simply bind it like that, but you could do that. What we're going to do is that we're going to clear the binding. So we're going to click on remove binding, and then we're going to create our own little binding. So we're going to click here, click on create binding. That gives us a function here, which we're going to just clean up a little bit. So we're going to make it say get player amount text. And then what we want this binding to do is we want it to get the blueprint game state reference, so the variable. So we're going to right click it, click convert to validated get. So basically what are we doing right now? Well, we're binding this text here to basically the value from the game state. And binding occurs on tick. So because it occurs on tick, we need to basically validate this variable. Why do we need to validate it? Well, if we do not validate it and run this on tick, then it can also go off of not valid. So if we were going to drag values out of here and this variable is not valid, that's going to cause us some errors. And why is it not valid? Well, on event construct, it first needs to execute the cast. So there can be a couple of ticks where we basically don't have this set as a valid reference yet. Because of that, we will simply validate it. We're then going to drag out of here and type in get current amount of players. Next up, we're going to type in string append. And then we're going to plug the string append into here. And then we're going to basically format it the way that we want it. So the current amount of players would go here. Then we're going to get a slash. And then we're going to get the minimum of required amount of players. So that's going to be 2. And then next to that 2, we're basically going to do spacebar players. Then we're going to hook that is valid up. And there we go. Now off of the is not valid, we can also type in something there. So if we copy paste the return node and do is not valid, then we can simply type in slash 2 players. So this way we know when it is not valid. We can then hit compile and save and hit play. And then we see 1 out of 2 players and 2 out of 2 players. So now we got a proper replicated player count up there on the top right. Then instead of hard coding this amount of minimum required amount of players, we can also hook that up to be dynamic installed inside of the game state. So let's do that. So back to the game state here, we can then click on the minimum required amount of players and we can set that to replicate as well. And then back inside of our widget, we can also get out the minimum amount of required players and we can hook that one up here so that everything is nice and dynamic. And then for this text over here, we're going to have to change the format a little bit because we no longer know if it is exactly 2. So what we're just going to type in is a little null players in case we don't have a reference. Okay, so there we go. So now we have a proper player count widget. We can then hit play, test it once more. So 1 player and then 2 out of 2 player. So they both properly update. Okay, so now that we see the correct player amount, then we need to start to code our final event, which basically makes sure that when the minimum amount of players that are required is met, that we want to start the countdown to start getting these players over to the actual island. So to do that, we are going to go into our HUD class first of all, and then we previously made a little widget here called match start countdown. So we need to add that here to the screen now. So we click on browse on the HUD, it takes us to the correct folder. And then here we see that widget I'm talking about. So widget blueprint match start countdown. So we're going to open this widget up, and then what we need in here is just a little bit of text. So we're going to drag in the text. We're then going to set this widget to be desired on screen to see the actual size. And then the text, let's make it say something like 15 seconds. Now we don't want it to be this massive, or actually, well, it is a countdown, so it can be quite massive because it is pretty important. So we're just going to keep it like that. We're then going to give this variable a name. So we're going to call it countdown text, countdown underscore text, and promote that to variable. Hit compile and save. And there we go. Then we need to add the match start countdown to the gameplay HUD widget to be here in the middle of the screen. So if you go down to the user created category, we then see our match start countdown. We drag it in, we set size to content, and then we anchor it to the top of the screen. So hold Control and Shift to anchor it to the top of the screen. So we do Control left click, Shift left click. Then on the Y, let's put it 100 down. And there we go. So by default, we don't want to see this time, because now if I am to click start, then we immediately see the 15 seconds just standing there, and that is not what we want. So we basically want this countdown to be gone, or we could have it say by default, we could actually have it say something like waiting for players to connect. So let's make it say that actually. So back in the match start countdown, we will just call it waiting for players ... So that's actually a good default text. So by default, everybody would then see waiting for players. We then go to the HUD, then we see that the widget hasn't updated here. So that's a little weird Unreal Engine bug. So if we remove it again and then anchor it to the top of our screen again, then there we go. So by default, everybody sees waiting for players. And then what we want to code is that if the minimum amount of players is met, it starts a countdown. So to do that, first of all, we need to go into the little widget here and click on the graph. And we need to have a custom event, which we will just call update widget. And then we want to set the text for the countdown widget here. So set text. And that's basically it. So that this will basically have some data coming through, probably a number, and then we're just going to be updating the widget here. So to do that, first of all, we need to go to the gameplay, game state here, and then we need some kind of a variable that is our countdown. So inside of the game state, we're going to click on variables, and let's just call it match start underscore countdown. And it's going to be of the type integer. Now we hit compile and save. And let's make the default variable here 15. So we want it to start at something like 15. And now we do want this to be a rep notify variable. So what is a rep notify? Well, a replicated variable, as we know, is a variable that basically sends data down to the client each time that there is an update. So if you check your class default settings, then you can see here that the game state is by default replicated. And then here we see an update frequency. So this game state updates 10 times per second. So when we have a replicated variable, it will attempt to 10 times per second send its data down to all of the clients. And then there is another variable of a replicated variable, which we call a rep notify variable. Now, when we click that, we see that a function gets created here. And what is a rep notify? Well, in short, a rep notify basically sends a notification whenever the value of the variable changes. So in the case that this value on the server goes from 15 to 14, then an automatic function is also executed. And that function is executed on both the server and on all the clients. So we can now double click the variable, or we can double click the function here on the left that gets created, and then we can start to code something here up to our choice whenever we get that notification that this variable has changed its value. And remember, this executes on the server and on all of the clients. So since the game state also exists on the clients, then we can easily have some logic over there that would communicate on our client to our client-side match start countdown widget. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing here. So basically, whenever the minimum amount of players is met, then we go off of the true here. And we only want to do that once. So we're going to have a do once here. And then why do we want that to occur once? Well, let's say that the minimum of required amount of players is equal to 10. Then we basically just want to start the match countdown and keep it started. So even if a player would then leave, which would make it 9 people in the session, but then we already say we have already started, so we're just going to keep it at started. So to fire this off, when the minimum amount of players is met, then we're going to set this match start countdown to 15. Let's do it like that. So then we started to 15. So let's set our default value here to -1. And this will make sense in just a little bit. And then we need a custom event in the graph here. And we're going to call this countdown match underscore countdown. And there we go. So when we set the notify to 15, we want to have some code. So the code here is inside of the wrap notify. If it is equal to 15, then we basically want to start the timer event. So the timer event is match countdown. So when it is equal to 15, we start match countdown. And then we want the match countdown event to take it over from there. So the match countdown event in that case is going to get the current countdown. It's going to subtract 1. So we're going to do -1. And then it's going to set the variable again. And then we will run down the logic in a little bit and it will all make sense. So basically, yeah, we're going to subtract 1 and then set it. And then we're going to check to see if it is equal to 0 or not inside of the variable itself. So what are we going to do? Well, the minimum amount of players is met. We set it to 15. That fires off the wrap notify. The wrap notify then says, hey, I am equal to 15. Because look, the default value is -1. So it changes to 15. It then says match start countdown. We then start to decrease it by 1. That means that, and then we set it again here. So that means the wrap notify fires again. And at that point, we're going to go off of, hey, it is not equal to 15 because right now it is 14. So here we're going to have to do a check to see if it is equal to 0. So here we're going to say is equal to 0. And then once it is equal to 0, then we basically want to do something here. So once it is equal to 0, we're going to basically start the event that the players need to go into the airplane and spawn from the air. So for that, we're now going to use a print string and say started match. And let's put that on our screen for, let's say, 15 seconds, and we will make it green. And at that point, we also want to basically stop the whole countdown. Now, if we haven't met 0 yet, then we want to basically continue the countdown. So then we call the countdown event again. So if we run through the logic once more, we get the minimum amount of players met. We start the countdown to 15. This starts the countdown, makes it go to 14. That means it is no longer 15, no longer 0. We go over here, it becomes 13, etc. Then eventually it hits 0 and it says started match. So there we go. But now we need to get this match start countdown variable all the way into the widget here. So each time it needs to update the widget. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're basically going to make ourselves a little function here and we're going to call it update underscore match start countdown widget. And then inside of the function, we're going to type in get all widgets class, not only on the top level, but just throughout the entire game. Then the widget that we want to get is our match start countdown widget. Now, obviously, each player only has one of these widgets, so we can simply type in get and get the widget at index 0. But we're just going to use it for each loop now. So we're going to for each loop off of all of the found countdown widgets. And then we're going to call that update widget event. Now, what do we want to send to that widget? Here we basically want to send the current timer value. So we're going to make a variable here called current time. And that comes through here. Then we want to set it here. So what we're going to do is string append. We will then plug that in over here. So the current time goes in here and then we just type seconds after it. That's basically what we wanted to do. Then we hit compile and save and there we go. Now also here, if the current time hits 0, then we basically want to remove this entire widget. So for that, we're basically just going to go off of here and then we're going to say is equal to 0. If that is false, then we keep updating it. If it is true, then we're going to say remove from parent. So then we just want this widget to basically remove itself from the screen of the user. Okay, so that's it for this logic. Then we want to go back inside of the game state Then obviously here we need to add a 1 second delay in here, because otherwise it's going to execute this all instantly. So for us to have proper countdown, we need to wait 1 second and then distract another one and update the variable. Then we wait 1 second again, distract another one, update the variable. And then how do we actually update the widget? Well, we made this function over here that will update the widget. So in here, we need to plug in our match start countdown, just like that. Hit compile and save. And then this function, we need to properly set it up over here inside of the rep notify. So if we open up the rep notify, grab this function, then basically each time that we do the match countdown, we want to call the update event here. So the update event can actually be called each time like this. So every time that the variable changes, we just want to update the UI. And there we go, guys. So that sums it up. Now we hit compile and save. So then let's go ahead and test this all out. So we're going to go and hit play. And then we see the match countdown here. So we see that the client is a little bit out of sync with the server here. And how does that happen? Well, that's because the client and the server both execute the countdown logic now. So we don't want that. So back here inside of the event graph, we want to make sure that it's only the server who is responsible for setting this countdown logic, because otherwise these timers are going to be out of sync here. So to do that, we can go inside of the rep notify. And then when we start the countdown here, only the server needs to do it, but the server also only needs to do all of this logic. So basically the server needs to do all of this logic except for updating the widget, because that we want to occur on the server and on all the clients. So to make sure that the server only does this part, we can then drag off of here inside of the rep notify and type in switch has authority. And that means that authority is basically equal to server, remote means client. So we only want the server to execute this part and the clients are fine with updating. So now if we hit play, then we see connecting and then we see a timer that is perfectly in sync. So there we go. So we're counting down, very excited because they're about to enter the battle royale. So 2, 1, and then in the top left corner, we see that the server says started match. And there we go, guys. So that's it for this video. Now we basically realized that we see a player count. If the minimum amount of players are met, we see that a countdown starts. And then once the countdown starts, then the server basically, once it hits 0, we see that the server says started match. That is the event that we need for our next video, in which we will then start the airplane to have the airplane fly over the island, and then players will basically be able to jump out and start playing the Battle Royale. Now, in the next episode, we are going to be working on actually having that airplane spawning in and having the players flying out of that. So that's going to be very excited. I also seen a lot of comments asking when I'm going to actually connect it to Steam. So actually I might do that one episode before we start working on the airplane, but we'll see. I'll decide that tomorrow. All right, guys, that's it for this video. I hope you liked it. If you want to check out the project, then be sure to download it on our Patreon. It's all available right there. Appreciate all of you guys and see you guys in the next one. Bye.